so here we go. The literature review. Um, the whole question, right? The question is why you do a literature review? So the formal answer is the purpose of a literature review is to write an essay that discusses all of your sources in relation to the main ideas you will be focusing on. Okay, so in our case, you want to examine the ways in which your traditional narrative came into being, right? So that we're sort of focusing on your traditional narrative for this literature review. You want to discuss the sources that help explain how the traditional narrative was created. That's one thing, so how it came into being and when about. The main elements that the traditional narrative contained, and then also how the narrative was spread through society. So those are sort of your three main ideas that you're trying to deal with in the literature review. Also, you're trying to use the language of the narrative paradigm, which I can talk about in a minute. Okay, so here's the idea. I'm breaking it down. Again, I'm trying to talk about the literature review in general, right? Like as a thing, because you're going to have to do these for other subjects probably several times. So I'm giving you the broad idea and then our specific, for the paper we're doing right now. So demonstrate your knowledge of a topic. That's one thing that you do with a literature review. So for you, it's going to be you're demonstrating your knowledge of the traditional narrative in whatever subject you're dealing with. You identify what has been done before and you identify any gaps. So this means here's how people have talked about the narrative, the traditional narrative before. And you're just keeping, did they forget something? Did they overlook something? Did they not think about something, right? So, this is how the traditional narrative's been talked about and believed in for years. And then you're just like, are there any gaps or not? That's just you trying to analyze it. For us, it means specifically you want to identify sources that explain how the traditional narrative came into being, right? So you want to find sources that talk about that. You want to provide a background to your inquiry. This means like your research question. That's what that is. And it's set out a research agenda. That's what a literature review does. So you're supposed to say, here's the landscape, right, of all the things that people are talking about or have talked about this traditional narrative. Arguments they've made about it or whatever. And then you're able to say, okay, so that's what all these people have said. Here's what I'm going to say. So you now have a place in the conversation. So the background for you is going to be the traditional narrative. That's essentially what this literature review is setting up. And then your research agenda eventually, for this essay, will be how it came into being, what the characteristics are, and how it was spread. Those three things, that's what you're trying to focus on. The essay after this, right, the final essay, you'll include some of this information and then you will sort of build on it to talk about how the narrative's changed. But for this essay, it's really just about focusing on the traditional narrative. Number 4, for why do a literature review, you locate your project, meaning you figure out what it is you want to focus on for the research based on what people are currently talking about and viewpoints of your subject, right? So it's supposed to help you figure out what you're going to deal with in the next essay as well. So this means you want to find sources that are focusing on the elements of traditional narrative that will change, right? So what you want to do in this essay, yes, you're going to talk about the traditional narrative, but you also want to make sure that you're picking things that eventually you can talk about how they change, right? Because you're going to do that in the future. So you want to make sure you're focusing on elements that you can talk about them changing. So that's essentially that idea. Number 5, it supports you in reviewing and refining your research topic, question, or hypothesis. Again, that's the general idea. Literature review's job is trying to help you figure out what your research essay is going to be about, and sort of what direction you're going to go in. Okay, so your literature review should summarize the existing conversation about the subject. So people talking about what's the usual traditional narrative, where did it come from, and you want to identify an area that you want to explore future in your next essay, which we talked about earlier. So you're basically just being like, okay, here's what everybody's saying about this narrative, and then I'm going to focus on the future. So your literature review, you want it to be about 5 pages long. You want to summarize and survey 6 to 8 sources that have to do with the narrative paradigm and your traditional narrative, right? So we're going to get the narrative paradigm into it. Your research essay, that's the one that it's at the very end, the final essay, will focus on explaining the change from one narrative to the next. So you're going to talk about, here's the main things, the reasons for change or the elements that changed it. You're going to talk about the consequences. So because it has changed, what has happened. And then you can also explain like where it's going, where the future of your narrative seems to be heading, something like that. Anyway, that's what you'll build on. That's for the final research essay. The literature review is an essay that seeks to examine the current information on a specific subject area. Okay, the goal is to present the arguments and ideas of different writers who have knowledge and offer perspectives on the subject. Again, your subject is the traditional narrative in your subject that you've chosen. The goal is to present a solid backdrop and describe the context of the narrative subject that you're dealing with, and you want to make connections with the traditional narrative and the narrative paradigm. That's going to be a challenge thing that we have to do. The focus needs to be on the writers of the articles. And so in week 4, right, we talked about writing K and actually the online discussion board. So the online discussion board is all about making sure that you refer to authors throughout, right? So this is my example of a generic way that you want your literature review to sound, like the language, right? So while Smith argues that blank, Anderson only partly agrees, while Smith focuses more on... So any ideas that you're trying to deal with, you want to connect them to authors, right? So this author says this, while this author says that, because the whole point of the literature review is to talk about the subject, but in relation to what others are saying about it, so that when you write your own, you sort of know where you fit in the conversation. Okay, and then this is the writing K part. So writing K for week 4, it has to do with the outline. And instead of having everybody do an outline, what I've decided is that you can go through the outline after you've done your rough draft, and you can sort of check off the elements that you have, right? So that you have in your introduction, do you have these 3 things, and you check them off yes or no, and then you do that for the main supporting ideas. And hopefully by doing that, you sort of figure out pretty quickly what it is you need to add or what it is you're missing. And then the conclusion, I said I'm introducing sort of a final source and I'm comparing it with other sources in general. That's, I don't know that that's absolutely mandatory, but it's a possibility. Number 3 is, though, you want to make sure that you're restating whatever your thesis was and then explaining what you're going to pursue in the research essay. This is where you are very explicitly like, okay, so I've shown that here's what people think about this idea and the traditional narrative and so on. And so now my research is going to focus on the different ways that it has changed, something like that. And that would be the conclusion. Writing style suggestions, I may do something on that just to give people examples, because after I look at some people's rough drafts, I can sort of give some specific examples of what I mean by these different ideas just for writing style. So I'll deal with that later. All right, and that is the end of the literature review.